Welcome to another episode of Bowcast. I am your hostess, Carrie Zolka. I'm super excited about this week's guest. We have on the line Justin Ma, who is the author of The Way of Archery. He's going to talk to us about traditional Chinese archery, which I stumbled upon by accident, and I went down the rabbit hole and spent like 3 hours watching his YouTube videos and doing all this Googling. So I'm really excited about this week's episode. Justin, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Carrie. Thanks for having me on.
So why don't we give the listeners just a high level overview of who you are, how you got into this style of archery, and a little bit about your background.
Sure, yeah. So I am actually a software engineer during the day. That's my day job. But, growing up when I was... Excellent. But growing up, I practiced Chinese martial arts. And so, an interest in Chinese martial culture was kind of at the back of my mind as well. And I was involved in Chinese martial arts, specifically wushu, at a pretty high level up until I was about, 21 years old. I competed as part of the U.S. team representing the U.S. for a couple of competitions. And then after that, I was a judge. I was actually an internationally certified judge. So the U.S. would send me to international competitions to be a judge at those, and I also organized some tournaments as well.
Wow.
So pretty deeply involved in Chinese martial arts at a younger age. But then, for political reasons, I kind of left the sport, got a little burnt out by that. But I still had this sort of lingering desire to sort of connect with my heritage, but I didn't want to return back to the wushu scene itself. And so I thought, well, there's this practice of archery that supposedly has a strong historical connection with Chinese culture, but there isn't really a lot of people doing it. And so I set out to kind of research it on my own, read what material there was available, and I kind of connect and weave with a lot of great people who helped me along the way. And I was eventually inspired to, along with my co-author, Jie Tian, to research and translate this archery manual from the Ming Dynasty in China. So this manual dates to 1637, so the 17th century. And we set out to translate that and eventually publish that in 2015. So that's kind of a very quick overview of how I got into it. And after the publication of the book, we've kind of we've been running training programs actually in the southeast United States, in Georgia, at a friend of ours, the Copadreyers, a Yap Copadreyer and Kay Copadreyer, who run a bamboo farm down there. So they grow their own bamboo, used to build bows and arrows and everything.
Oh, wow.
And so a lot of interesting connections along the way, and that's kind of a start for how I got into the art there.
Okay. And explain to the listeners who are not familiar with, so quick overview of Bowcast. We just relaunched, and it was always very focused on compound bow. And one of the reasons I stumbled across your stuff was because we had quite a few people reach out to me and just be like, hey, are you going to have anything for us traditional shooters and stuff? And I was just kind of Googling around different, because I'm not super familiar with traditional archery at all. Which is when I came across, there's a ton of information out there about traditional, and there are, the 5 different types of bows or whatever. So can you just maybe explain to the listeners and me the difference between, say, the Chinese bow compared to, say, just a regular recurve or a longbow?
Okay, sure, yeah. And that's a whole can of worms in itself as well, because
I'm sure.
because some people will be like, oh well, you know, the Chinese bow or the Mongolian bow is like this specific shape and this, and it's like, I like to provide a nuanced answer to that. So, you know, I guess we're familiar with the recurve bow these days. It has a shelf, sort of almost a center cut shelf, a pistol grip, and is shaped a particular way. The longbow, whether it's a more modern type of longbow with a cut shelf, or if it's a more traditional longbow, which is like a self bow, made out of a yew staff. I guess your listeners are familiar with that as well. So the Chinese bow, the thing is, the Chinese use different materials of bows. So they definitely use self bows, but the bows themselves would have a different shape, a little more similar to the home guard bow, where there's kind of like a wide midsection in the limbs, and then the tips taper towards the end. So there have been specimens like that excavated. The Chinese also used a wooden composite or bamboo composite bows, made from multiple pieces. And then probably what people might be more familiar with as being characterized as a Chinese bow are the horn bows, or the horn composite bows. So these are bows made with materials that, like, for example, there would be horn on the belly, like water buffalo horn, for example, a core made out of wood or bamboo, and then on the back, layers of sinew, which act as kind of like an ancient versions of fiberglass there, and then with various decorations and coatings there. Now, as for the shapes of the bows themselves, they would be recurve, but you would see static tip recurves on this, and then you will see different shapes and sizes of those tips as well. Things that with very short tips, such as some Ming Dynasty style bows, which are similar to like Korean bows or Turkish bows, and then you might have ones with tips that are very large, like the ones that are used by the Manchus in the Qing Dynasty. Qing Dynasty being 17th through 20th century, and then you might see long tips but sort of swept back. Things that are more akin to what you would recognize as a Hun bow, what the Huns would use back in the first millennia AD. Wow. And that, so it runs the gamut in terms of shapes that were used. And I have some material on my site, The Way of Archery. Some of the tutorial articles that I have there kind of provide an overview of the types of bows that one could use for the practice of Chinese archery, and it kind of blends into the discussion of what are the shapes of different Asiatic bows, right? What did, the Mongols, the Koreans, the Turks, the Middle Eastern cultures, even the Eastern European cultures use for this style of archery. Now, a lot of what they have in common is that there are no shelves on these bows. It's just a straight handle, because they didn't have the technology to have this cut shelves. But also they were using these bows from horses as well. Yeah. They were riding on a horse, and some people these days are have a lot of dexterity and maybe might be able to knock an arrow on a bow with a shelf, but that's typically not. That's like a very, very rare case. Most people, like, when you're shooting a bow like that, you just want a simple handle, because it's just easier to exactly. Yeah. And, that is, and you'll see a simple handle like that on the Old English self bows as well, right? It's just a straight handle. And the way you would shoot a bow like this typically is with using a thumb ring or the thumb draw. So poking your thumb around the string to pull it, rather than pulling the string with your fingers.
Oh, well, so that's a whole other. Hold on, before we even get into that, because I have many questions about that section. Because I did go through. I went through the page you mentioned, thewayofarchery.com/tutorials, and first off, the bow that you're holding in the picture in the Beyond Strength thumbnail is beautiful. It is stunningly gorgeous. These bows have the prettiest curvature. And I did notice when as you're pulling back, I'm like, that looks so awkward because I'm used to a release, you know? So I'm like
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
looking at the picture and I'm like, how is he even drawing that back and not, you like kind of simulate it and you're like, I don't know what muscles I'm even using. So
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
the, okay, well, let's just get into the thumb draw. Let's just talk about that. Explain the difference between that, finger shooting, and using a release. Like, the big differences between the three styles. Oh, and I mean, of course, you've got back releases and all them, but we're just going to talk about the simple three for now.
Sure, sure. And I'll try my best to articulate the difference between that and the releases, because I don't have too much familiar with compound archery, though I've seen people shoot
Yeah.
compound bows before. Yeah, so obviously the finger release, you're drawing the string back with 2 or 3 fingers, either with fingers under the nock or in a split finger type of configuration, and that's the style of pull that most people associate with Western traditional archery and also modern recurve archery. You would typically wear a tab for that. With the release, you have a simple mechanical device that holds the string back and kind of minimizes the perturbance of the string, and it lets you release the string after you've reached full draw. With the thumb draw, so you're basically curling your thumb around the string. The string will usually rest below the crease of your thumb, and of course that's a lot of pressure to put on one single finger, and so you typically wear some sort of thumb protection, either leather, although I would prefer a ring actually on there as well. So a ring could be made of materials such as metal, horn, ram's horn, water buffalo horn, maybe wood, sometimes made out of precious stones as well. So you might see antique rings that were made from things like jade. Now, not always for shooting purposes. The thing is, in these cultures, in Chinese culture and other Asiatic cultures, the archer's ring has a lot of symbolism associated with it as well, because it signifies your martial prowess. But, of course, you may have a ring that's used for practical everyday shooting, and then you might have a ring that's more of a display, just showing, it might have a little more bling. It would be like a little more fancy, but it would just sort of indicate that you have such skills. So that's a whole sort of discussion in and of itself, because you'll see some museum collections with some really fantastic looking thumb rings there, and that's a whole area worth exploring.
Mm-hmm. So,
I should mention actually, that this is relevant to the earliest thumb ring that was actually excavated from China during the Shang Dynasty, which is, I think the date of this excavation was 1200 BC. And that was and what's interesting about this actually is this is a ring belonging to Fu Hao, and she was one of the consorts for the king at the time, and she led military expeditions, fighting enemies of the Shang Dynasty. So she was actually, a general, and she was buried with, a lot of treasures and martial items as well, such as thumb rings and weapons and various things. And so the thumb ring, and the thumb ring was one of those things that they excavated from her tomb.
That's interesting. Well, and we'll talk about the military aspects of using this, and also you'd mentioned that there's so many things I want to ask you, and then my brain is going like in 8 different directions, because you also mentioned the whole archery from horseback, which is obviously there's just really no way to do that with a compound bow. So I do want to, looking at the pictures before we move on, just talking about the releases and the anchor points. So with the compound bow, you have the string, usually I anchor it to my nose, and then I've got the kisser button. What do you guys use as an anchor point to be consistent?
Okay. So that first, it depends on how far back you're drawing. So some people prefer a shorter draw length. In that case, you could always use a face anchor. But if you're drawing longer, and there are some advantages, at least biomechanically, for drawing a bit longer. But if you're drawing longer, obviously it's you wonder, well, where's the anchor right there? What I teach my students is that there is an anchor. There's the up, down, and left, right anchor would be, where the arrow shaft touches your face, or where the arrows touch your face. Now, then that leaves the front back anchor. Like, what is that position going to be? And often you can use a draw length indicator by touching the back of your arrowhead. And so that's kind of like the ancient version of a clicker right there.
Yeah.
So you draw back, and there's an old Chinese expression that if your finger doesn't touch the back of the arrowhead, then it's like shooting blind.
Wow.
And that's kind of an indication of, having a consistent draw length is important for accuracy.
Mm-hmm.
And so they had that notion there. So that third dimension usually is accomplished by having a draw length indicator, or what we like to call a bow hand anchor on the arrow. But if you don't have that, especially on a horseback, you don't want to have exactly sized arrows, because you're jostling around the horses. And so for safety, the ancient texts would recommend, if you're on a horse, have an arrow that's a little bit longer than your actual draw length for a margin of safety. In which case, that third dimension of the anchor, the front back, you would establish that just through muscle memory.
Okay. So.
Yeah.
Well, and anchor points and all that's, and drawing all leads into your form, of course.
Mm-hmm.
How on earth, what do you think your biggest struggle when you're teaching someone proper form to shooting traditional archery? What do you think is your biggest either struggle point, or the one point that you always make sure you check with every single person?
Oh, okay. So lately when I'm teaching people, if it's someone who's a beginner, then the big point I emphasize there is their bow shoulder, because that's kind of the foundation for everything else that happens in the draw. It's the part where if you don't get it right and you try to move up in weight, then that can result in injury. Not right away, but over time, with overuse in an improper alignment, then that can cause injury for the archer's bow shoulder, and that's going to be a very annoying thing to fix and correct later on. So bow shoulder for sure. Okay. For the beginners is one thing that I emphasize, and that's the manual that we translated, which was written by that gentleman from the Ming Dynasty, and whose name is Gao Ying. He detailed in his 40-year archery career. He wrote this book when he was about 66 years old. He detailed sort of his struggles. How he was kind of very, very talented early on, and then he kind of veered off the path and tried to imitate the techniques of archers who were very flashy but didn't exactly have, proper technique. And Gao Ying, the author of this book, would end up injuring himself in the process, and he kind of documents his struggle to correct his technique, and how he's sort of driven to give this message out to others.
Sure.
As well. And so and bow shoulders is a very sort of foundational element for that.
That's crazy. Okay, that's interesting. So and I'm just trying to correlate this. Like I said, I'm not real familiar with traditional archery. So when I'm shooting my compound bow, I really have to square up my hips and my shoulders, and like I have to be really rigid. With the traditional archery, is it more the upper body? Because I can't imagine you can't really do that when you're riding a horse. I have a horse. There'd be no way I could shoot a compound bow. Well, I guess I can, because I've shot my bow sitting down. But do you know what I mean? Like, but it's such a pain in the ass.
Right. Well, so I don't know exactly how to relate this to the compound bow posture. But what I can say for the bow shoulder, it's really more about setting it in a way so that the force of the bow, as it's being pulled back, is being directed more into your torso, and that it's positioned in a way that it's more in unison with using the big muscles of your back. And this kind of gets into one of the videos that I cover, a couple of tutorial videos that I have, one on the bow shoulder and then one on the draw. And these are based on the techniques that were described in that 17th century Chinese manual. And I've also kind of cross-referenced it with studying the traditional techniques of other heavy bow military cultures, such as the English warbow archers, and like the African elephant hunters, and so forth. And because I was able to notice commonality between them in terms of how they position their shoulders and what their draw looks like. And so the main thing here that I emphasize is for the bow shoulder is being able to settle it. And what I mean by that is being able to sort of bring it, depress it down, and then retract it towards the spine prior to the draw, because that kind of gets the shoulder. It's like planting a flag, right? You want to get the base, very solid so that it can accept whatever stresses there are after that. And then, scapular depression, retraction, and then the medial rotation of the upper arm or of the elbow to kind of lock things in. And without getting too deep into this, basically what happens, that motion, the muscles used to engage that shoulder and to really secure it are compatible with the muscles that you use for drawing the bow as well, right? Which are the traps, the lats, the rhomboids. And I emphasize that, and I actually sort of to drive the point home, a lot of what you see on sort of my YouTube channel is saying, like, here's the technique. I'm applying it to shooting heavy bows that you would probably see back in the day in those historical times. Bows in excess of 80 pounds, 100 pounds, 120 pounds. Lately I practice with bows weighing like 128 pounds, maybe a little upwards of 130 pounds, just to see, just to research, what are the limits of what I can handle with this technique. Because if, and I'm not a big person at all, but if I'm able to handle weights like this, then handling lighter bows at target weights will be more easygoing, right? It's going to be a less stressful experience. Yeah. And so the bow shoulder is foundational to that. How we draw, the draw motion itself is actually pretty foundational to that as well.
That's so cool. So you mentioned that y'all had some badass chicks back in the day, in the military, which is awesome. Tell me a little bit more about that, if you don't mind. Just some of the tradition and the history and the, because lots of people who are into traditional archery really embrace the tradition and the history and the culture of it as well.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you brought that up too, because when someone says, what is Chinese archery? I struggle to find a single sentence answer to that. Sure. Because, like you said, it involves culture, history, as well as, the techniques, the equipments, and all everything. It's this one cohesive whole with many dimensions and facets. And so I guess when we're talking about history, I mentioned Fu Hao, who was the female general, the consort to the Shang Dynasty king, and the importance of archery to Chinese culture. So archery was always, like, whenever you had a new emperor of a dynasty, and you have the bio of the emperor, then there'd always be this line like, "Oh, and he was a good archer." Like that had to be as like an obligatory. But it kind of shows you kind of the status that archery had. And actually, in the first millennia during the Zhou dynasty, the first millennia BC, I should mention, first millennia BC, they would actually use archery contests, or what they call the archery ritual, to select rulers of individual fiefdoms within the Zhou kingdom. So it's like you have the pair of archers who walk up to the platform. There's a very formal bowing protocol. They bow to the hosts, and then they'll shoot the target. And it's not just enough to hit the target, but you have to do it with good form. And then eventually there are rounds where you have to shoot the target to music as well. And like you have to release, on a particular beat, and it's got to hit. And that was sort of a test of, whether you had it together, like whether you had what it took to be the ruler of a particular part of the kingdom. And afterwards, the winner would serve alcohol to the loser for their health. It's like, oh, better luck next time. Here's a drink. Yeah, exactly. And there would be people would so that people are not too bitter afterwards. But no, that kind of shows you how important it was as well. And you had famous philosophers, Confucius, for example. He was actually an archery teacher. He had a famous expression: gentlemen have no need to compete, but if they must, let it be through archery.
Wow.
Yeah, it could have been a personal bias for him. It's like he enjoyed archery, so he wanted to make an exception.
Yeah,
an exception for that.
And anybody listening to this podcast is so like, oh, I'm still stealing that and posting it on Twitter.
Yeah. It's like street fight. No need for that. Just shoot some archery. Yeah, and so I mean, yeah, with Confucianism, it's actually pretty intertwined with Taoism as well. There are some stories of like here's an archer who thinks he's all that. He's got the technique. But then a monk says, well, or do you really have a handle on this? And so the monk takes this guy to the edge of a cliff. And so the archer starts freaking out. And then he realizes that, he has to be able to shoot, in very sort of high pressure situations to really show that he's got mastery of this. So, so Confucius, and then, I think the last thing I could say, and I could say a lot on the cultural aspect of things, but, the manuals, you'll find some historical manuals documenting, what were military tactics or weapons used in particular dynasties. And the bow is always mentioned as the first among weapons, like the most prestigious.
Sure.
Which is kind of ironic because the practice of Chinese archery, and this relates to what you were saying before, it's like some people asked, what is Chinese archery? I've never heard of this before. And that it's kind of, it was a lost art for a while because towards the modern era, archery kind of lost its, favor compared to using firearms. Firearms just got better, and and also I would say the political circumstances of China through the 20th century, without getting too deep into that, it's a little chaotic. Archery is probably the last thing on your mind given some of the crazy stuff that happened over there. So, but I'd say fortunately, in the 21st century, there's a lot of people who are interested in reviving the practice, myself included, and are trying to study old documents and trying to reconstruct what they can from this, because it was definitely kind of a briefly lost tradition there, and we're trying to do what we can to promote and raise awareness of that.
Sure. Well, and hopefully people listening to this episode will have a ton of takeaways, and one of them being an interest in maybe Googling it more, or going to your website, or hold on, I'm going to grab it real quick. thewayofarchery.com, and ordering your book. It's on Amazon. It's easy to order. Hopefully they'll be more interested in and just use the Google machine. Or anybody
for sure. And
Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, for folks who read the book, it's a fun read too, because it's, as I mentioned, Gao Ying, he was 66 years old at the time, and you've probably had this archery coach who is kind of curmudgeonly and very blunt and matter of fact about, it's like, you gotta, it's all on the shoulder here, but he's got this kind of dry sense of humor too, so it's very fun to read. Not just about the archery technique there, but kind of getting a window into the historical happenings of the time.
Sure.
A big reason he wrote that book was because this was near the end of the Ming Dynasty. He was loyal to the Ming Emperor at the time, but of course, what's happening there is that the Manchus from the northeast have invaded and have established the Qing Dynasty, and so it's kind of this was sort of Gao Ying's rallying call. It's like, look, I'm giving away the secrets of archery so that you can use this to help defend the country. Of course, that came a little too late. There was a new dynasty founded on that. Like, oops, a little too late. But I think it's a valuable. Well, fortunately, later generations such as us, we have a tome that we can refer to sort of reconstruct some of the techniques.
Totally. And I think I haven't asked you, but I feel pretty comfortable putting it out to the listeners that if you listen to this episode and you're like, oh my gosh, I have so many more questions, or oh, I'd really like clarification on this point or this particular topic, you can email Justin, thewayofarchery@gmail.com, or you can email bowcastpodcast@gmail.com. Send in your questions, and maybe we'll do a follow-up episode, because I think I have lots of more questions. So
for sure. Yeah, sorry, I'm just kind of like, it's brain dump.
No, I love it.
Like,
I love it. I love it. I know. And unfortunately, bumping up against time here, and I'm like, I could talk for another hour and ask you all these other questions and delve really into the history and hear some stories and stuff. And so I definitely, if you don't mind, think a second episode will be warranted.
Sounds good.
All right. Well, Justin, thank you so much for taking time out of your day. Why don't you tell the listeners where they can find out more about you, your website, social media, channels, and I will definitely link them all in the show notes as well. But why don't you tell them?
Sure thing. Yeah. So you can find the work by myself and my co-author Jed Hin at thewayofarchery.com. That's all one word. And you can also find The Way of Archery on YouTube as well. We have a YouTube channel where we have demonstrations of our particular style of Chinese military archery. Of course, there were like many styles of Chinese archery that were practiced. But we have demonstrations, tutorials, videos to help give an introduction to people who want to get started in the style as well. And that'll be a good starting point.
Cool. Thank you so much.
All right. Thanks a lot.